here because I have to click the slides. Should I just, okay. Hey everyone, and thank you so much all for being here today. I'm really excited to be presenting a paper I wrote called Justice and Jurisdiction, the Movement of Capital in Menan. And I also want to say thank you for Camp Ponapite and for the TAA and the TFN for, letting us be here. I'm going to be talking about Red Squirrel Road, and I acknowledge that, I'll be critiquing it, but, the way that we all came up here was through Red Squirrel Road. So it's kind of that relationship there that, I do keep at the forefront of my mind. So through this presentation, we're going to explore concepts of infrastructure and jurisdiction, see how infrastructure becomes an expression of jurisdiction, and finally consider what infrastructure otherwise might look like. And so while a deep history of Menan is really crucial concept, we've been hearing all about it for the past 2 days, and I want to honor that there are better voices suited to telling that story, so I'm going to leave that space for them. To start, I want to present a really dense core thesis of my paper, and we can break it down as we go. And that is, infrastructure is an expression of jurisdiction, and under colonial ownership, it functions as political technology that facilitates the movement of capital, enables dispossession, and obscures the violence of infrastructure expansion under the guise of development. Okay, so let's break it down. The first piece is jurisdiction, which I define as the authority to have authority, and thus the authority to govern. In settler colonial context, this is the power to classify land, as like the fiction Crown Land, and other legal tools like the Indian Act, resource permits, general land use policy, and most recently, Bill C-5. And this authority is interpreted through the singular lens of Crown sovereignty, meaning that it doesn't exist in plurality with other concepts. But this authority needs to be made real on the ground. This is where infrastructure comes in. Infrastructure, whether social, like a legal system, or physical, like a logging road, become a physical expression of the Crown's jurisdictional claim. When the Red Squirrel Road was approved, despite the TAA's unresolved land claim, the road itself becomes a tool to legitimize Crown authority and discipline anyone who refuses its terms. Once settler jurisdiction is asserted and stabilized through infrastructure, like a logging road, the path is cleared, literally and figuratively, for extraction to proceed. And this process facilitates the movement of capital, such as timber moving out of forests on logging road, or oil moving through a pipeline. And this transformation inherently requires dispossession. To build a logging road, you must erase what was there before, including ecosystems, sacred sites, and any relational stewardship that is tied to it. The violence of this process is obscured by framing it as necessary development, and at the same time, the actual violence that happens is the state's response to land defenders, like injunctions and arrests, and all under the guise of keeping law and order. So this brings me to making the distinction between Crown jurisdiction and Anishinaabe jurisdiction. We've been hearing about, the TAA's form of jurisdiction throughout this weekend, so again, there are better voices, but I'm going to try to sum it up in this circumstance. Crown's jurisdiction stands in direct contrast to Anishinaabe jurisdiction. Whereas Crown jurisdiction is set in law, allows for little to no legal plurality, meaning that it either tries to assimilate or erase other legal orders, and often serves the mean of capitals. Anishinaabe jurisdiction is not a static legal static legal status, and this is as described by John Burroughs and as others that we've heard throughout this weekend. It's an ongoing practice of governance, refusal, and world building, grounded in responsibilities to the land that are passed down through community. It's a legal order that grows directly from the land itself, passed down through ceremony and oral history. And it is a governance system where humans have mutual obligations with the land itself that must be respected. These two conflicting ideas of jurisdiction, one of sovereignty, sovereign authority, and one of mutual obligation, came to a critical point in the case of Red Squirrel Road. The Crown's proposal to expand the road was the culmination of decades of encroachment into the Temagami Anishinaabe unceded territory. This is where the power of refusal becomes clear. And when I say this is decades of culmination, this is just some of the major, points that show that. And this is other forms of infrastructure, like private cottages, leases. That's a form of infrastructure. Churches and the Hudson's Bay Company that were on Bear Island. Maple Mountain Ski Resort that was proposed and also opposed by TAV. And we know that didn't come to fruition. And land cautions are a form of counter infrastructure, and we'll get to that. So again, settler infrastructure is not total. Its power depends on continuous enforcement through law, land policy, and public consent. And when I say public consent, I'm specifically talking about settler consent. Therefore, refusal, like on Retzkola Road blockades, transforms the road into a site of contested power. The blockades become a form of counter-infrastructure, an infrastructure of resistance that physically disputes the Crown's assumed authority. And these moments of contestation are powerful. They prove that infrastructure can be more than a channel for capital. It can be a site for political struggle and resurgence. So then this opens the question, if infrastructure can be resisted, can it also be imagined? And this is just a quote. I actually forgot to switch the slide earlier, but about Indigenous blockades and a summary of what I was saying. And this is just a map from Earth Roots where all the blockades were happening, and this was not all the TAA, this is from other environmental organizations, and that in itself has like a very tenuous relationship that we don't have to get into now, but to also keep in mind that was there's history there. So then, talking about colonial infrastructure, what does infrastructure otherwise look like? And first I'm reminded of a story that Leanne Simpson tells about beavers, the Mick, in her short history of the blockade. She talks about how their infrastructure, which are dams, are a form of life-giving infrastructure. Their work serves an entire ecosystem, creating wetlands and new habitats in a symbiotic relationship with their surroundings. And another emerging idea is the rights of nature, which is going to be the focus of my future research. And before I delve in, I really want to caution that the rights of nature is not an inherently Indigenous idea, or Indigenous concept, just as infrastructure is not inherently colonial. Its potential lies in how it's applied. And the concept has very different forms, but at its core, it suggests that nature has inherent rights and that humans must enter into a respectful relationship to ensure it can flourish. The goal is to reframe our relationship, and again, our as in settler and general like Western legal systems, relationship with the natural world by moving ecosystem from being considered as property to something being to be owned and used to being recognized as a rights-bearing entity in its own right. This framework asserts that an ecosystem, a river, a forest, has the inherent right to exist, flourish, and maintain its vital cycles and evolve. However, one of the key challenges that I'm keeping at the forefront of my mind is that there's a risk that the rights of nature could be assimilated into existing Crown legal structures, potentially mirroring the legal fiction of corporate personhood, rather than fundamentally changing our relationship with the land. And I'm hoping to explore how to navigate this problem. But I generally stand by that Crown law needs structural changes because it's built on, colonial beliefs. And while the philosophies of nature having inherent value have existed for millennia, as we've heard over this weekend, the specific legal term right of nature has only been recent in history of Western law. It emerged in the 1970s, famously articled by a law professor, Christopher Stone, in his article, Should Trees Have Standing? And this idea was also echoed in dissent by a U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas in 1972, in 1972, in the case Sierra Club versus Morton, which is just Walt Disney and their ski resort, where he argued that natural objects ought to have legal standing to sue for their own preservation. And during that time, he was shut down by a lot of law journalists calling him crazy. So it was definitely not the time. He was just a tiny bit ahead of his time. So with that in mind, we can look how it's been in practice, how it's been used in practice. In New Zealand, the Whanganui River has been granted full legal rights of a person, and it has two appointed guardians, one from the Maori iwi and one from the Crown, who are legally bound to act in the river's best interest. Also in New Zealand, the Te Arewera Forest, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it correctly, is no longer a national park owned by the Crown, but it actually just owns itself. And in Ecuador, the constitution was rewritten to recognize the rights of Pachamama, or Mother Earth, wherein any person, community, or nation can go to public authorities to enforce these rights and does not need to prove personal harm to file a lawsuit. But specifically in Ecuador, there have actually been a lot of problems with the application, but the fact that they have it in their constitution is a very big step in comparison to other countries, including Canada. So my future research will hopefully ask the question, when grounded in Anishinaabe law, how can this legal tool be adapted to support the Temagami Anishinaabe and the Temagami First Nation in asserting their jurisdiction? In what ways can the rights of nature aid the TAA and TFN in achieving their conservation objectives and improve jurisdictional authority over their traditional lands? And finally, how can rights of nature function as a legal mechanism to safeguard culturally significant areas? And what is the viability of using rights of nature in this legal concept? In this legal capacity. Ultimately, we have to remember that infrastructure is never neutral. It tells a story of power. But as the blockades on Red Squirrel Road show us, these stories can be challenged. By questioning who infrastructure serves, we can begin to reimagine a world and build a world where it doesn't serve capital, but life itself. It's clear that the path forward is not just going to be new laws. It needs to be a new vision, a new relationship to the land, at least for the Western world. And for that vision, I want to turn to the final word over to late TAA Chief Gary Potts, who articulated the goal of the struggle so powerfully in 1992, which are, we are stepping out into the future from the past. We have all of this land for the Temagami Anishinaabe self-sufficiency for thousands of years. We know we can coexist on this land with our neighbors and develop structures to ensure that we are living in a framework of coexistence that proves for the pride and dignity of everyone living on our land. Thank you so much.